All right, my English teacher friends. So I'm excited about this video. So there's a little trick that I want to show you in this video on how to sustain a clear, cogent line of reasoning. And for those of you that are familiar with my work, you know that I often use children's literature to really exemplify and illustrate for students how to create that line of reason. So my template that I use to construct my body paragraphs is called the Syllogistic Method, which we'll get into in just a second. And a syllogism is a nice, organized, patterned, methodic way of thinking and introducing, sustaining your argument. And that pattern is something that I see in a lot of children's literature. And to model that today, we're going to do a couple of things. One, my AP language friend said, "Hey, could you show the yarn test for a work of rhetorical analysis? Take us through a whole rhetorical analysis essay." So that's something I'm going to do. And we have a fascinating speech that we're going to look at today. Elizabeth Bonker, her valedictorian speech, commencement address from 2022 at Rollins College, and it's entitled "Be the Light." So Elizabeth Bonker has non-speaking autism, and it was such a poignant, powerful speech. A couple of students brought it to my attention. They showed it to me on YouTube. And so I have the transcript for the speech, and it's also available on YouTube. So that's first and foremost. I'll take you through how to write a rhetorical analysis of that speech. And then we're going to use a text called Extra Yarn. It's a children's story by Mac Barnett. And I'll demonstrate how to do that yarn test yet again, but with rhetorical analysis in mind, because thus far in my YouTube channel, I've only done it for literary analysis. So we'll get a lesson on how to sustain a clear line of reasoning. So for those of you that aren't familiar with Extra Yarn, I'll give you a quick synopsis of it without being totally in violation of copyright. So we have this girl, her name's Annabelle, and she comes upon a box of yarn, and it's full of these bright, vibrant, endless colors of yarn. And she makes a couple of things for herself, and her classmates want her to knit things for them, and she just has so much yarn that she ends up even knitting things, sweaters for the trucks and the automobiles in towns and the building, right? And then there's this wicked man that wants to steal it from her and all that good stuff. So basically the moral of the story is this, right? In terms of how I use it, there's so much yarn that students have in terms of templates that they have at their disposal. So with my templates of the declarative and the inverted thesis, as well as the syllogistic method, every essay can be written the exact same way. So what students do right here in rhetorical analysis is exactly what they do in literary analysis, argument, persuasion, synthesis, and even research. So just carry the yarn from essay to essay to essay. So this is really cool for AP teachers in particular, because a lot of my students follow me from pre-AP to AP Lang, then to AP Lit. And they say after a while, "Holy cow, you're not kidding. We can write the essay the exact same way." And it's like, yep, all three of the FRQs on Lang, you approach it with the exact same template as you do the templates for FRQ 1, 2, and 3 on literature. So it's all the same thing. So for this Elizabeth Bonker piece, how do I write the introduction? And as always, you got two options, right? You can declare or invert. Now, for those of you that are coming from the literary analysis video, you saw students invert the thesis. And that's kind of the aha to this. This is the big eureka. For literary analysis, students always want to invert the thesis, but for rhetorical analysis, students always want to declare. So let me unpack the two here. All right, first and foremost, if we take a look at FRQ2s from the AP language exam, implicit in those prompts are two questions. And these two questions are also implicit in FRQ 1 and FRQ 2 of the AP Literature exam. It's really cool how students can do this. It really demystifies the process. If they answer these two questions and ascertain a correct reading of the rhetorical analysis passage, they're going to crush it, right? They're going to crush it. So there's two questions. What is the authorial intent, and how does the author construct meaning? So if they focus on these two questions, they're guaranteed to get themselves to a thesis. Now, the big trick is to get them to a correct read. They have to read the passage correctly. So there's two ways to do this. As I said, declare or invert. But before my students even begin to write, what I have them do is this. I have this poster on my wall, and it's a big Velcro laminated poster. And as rhetorical terms and devices are introduced over the course of the academic year, we add it to our wall. So as we're reading the Elizabeth Bonker speech, what we do is I tell them, try to find the three most pertinent, relevant, salient terms and devices that Bonker uses to construct the meaning of her speech. So we pick and choose. Those three terms, and sometimes it's four, are going to anchor the thesis. So here's what we do. Students are going to begin their thesis by answering the question, how does the author construct meaning? And I want them to focus on the most salient, relevant, germane, pertinent, rhetorical feature of the piece. How does the author construct meaning? So when you answer that question, you are declaring the thesis, right? So you begin with the thesis. My students, what they do is they focus on those 3 to 4 terms and have a heavy concentration of how does the author construct meaning. The last sentence is, what is the authorial intent? And this is the direct opposite of what my students do for literary analysis. So it's 3 sentences, construction of meaning, 1 sentence, authorial intent. So this is what we mean by declarative, right? Start with the point. That's why I have it in a triangle here. Sometimes in arguments, people say, what's your point? What's your point? Get to your point, right? So immediately out of the gate, students get to the point. So it's, how does the author construct meaning? And you have context and background that sprinkles into that as they're working in those first 3 sentences. The other thing we want to see, because it's an academic paper, is tier 2 level vocabulary. And what I mean by that is your average run-of-the-mill SAT level words. So a little bit of colloquial, a little bit of vernacular, quite a bit of tier 2 without sounding pretentious and contrived. So we talk about all that stuff in my Word Study Academy, in my 5-week mastermind, and I teach teachers how to set up their own word study academies. And then another thing that my students do quite well are manipulate their sentence constructs, manipulate their syntax. So in my Nuance Academy, I teach teachers that there's 12 different ways to construct a single sentence, so as to avoid that short, simple declarative sentence followed by short, simple declarative sentence, or independent clause, independent clause, independent clause, right? Struggling and emerging writers do that all the time. So to have nice voice, rhythm, flow, going for that sophistication point at all times. You'll see my students flex on their syntax a little bit. And then introductions, when you use my templates, are always going to be 4 sentences long. So if that went over your head, sit tight. I have a whole bunch of examples of introductions that I'll talk you through. And then quickly, just as a flyby, because we're not doing it, the inverted thesis is 3 sentences, what is the authorial intent? Last sentence, how does the author construct meaning? So it's just the opposite of what we do for rhetorical analysis. And if you want more of that, do a deeper dive on that. I got a ton of literary analysis in my YouTube channel, so go check that out. So let's take a look at a few here. So again, you'll see it's 4 sentences. We read the Elizabeth Bonker piece together, but as the year progresses, I want students to read on their own and be able to find their own 3 terms and or devices. But you'll see immediately In this, students begin with what they deem to be the most important aspect, the most important feature, rhetorical feature of the piece. So let's see what this student did. Elizabeth Bonker, unencumbered by her non-speaking autism, breaks down the purpose of life to 4 basic words. Life is for service. So in this sentence, you got some implication. And I like it when my students imply their rhetorical terms and devices instead of always explicitly stating it. So in this, you kind of got a hint of ethos and logos, right? The logos, the exigence of the pieces. Life is for service. But we're touching upon the fact that she has non-speaking autism that's not hindering her ability to deliver this address whatsoever. So you got a little bit of ethos and a little bit of logos. So let's see where it goes from here. Let's check out the next 2 sentences where we flesh this out. Addressing the graduating class of Rollins College, Bonker, despite her obvious differences, unifies the audience with the collective use of plural pronouns. So the third one we got is syntax, plural pronouns. Further, she bolsters the idea that this graduating class can achieve great things in life by drawing references to the likes of Mr. Rogers, Viktor Frankl, Helen Keller, and Alan Turing, individuals much like herself who overcame seemingly insurmountable odds. So you got allusion, right? This reference, this juxtaposition to these people. So you got ethos, logos, syntax, allusion. Last sentence, just wrap it up with the authorial intent. For Bonker, the secret of life is simple. Share your gifts and shine your God-given light brightly. So let's break this down before we take a look at a few others. Note the sentence complexity here. This one's really, really good. I mean, this first sentence has a colon, but look at this third sentence, how that flows and how it's punctuated correctly, right? So my students don't do that because they're born with it. Like, I explicitly teach that in my Nuance Academy, how to write complex sentences and how to flex on the syntax every now and then to get the voice, the rhythm, the flow. Note the vocab. Good words. Unencumbered is good. Let's see. Unifies is nice. And again, you don't overdo it. Stay in the wheelhouse. Insurmountable, right? So don't overdo the vocab. You got to stay in your wheelhouse, stay in your lane. Sound natural, but be an elevated academic self. And this kid out of the gate is on blazing fire. This is solid. So correct read of the text. It focuses on the construction of meaning in 3 sentences, 1 sentence, authorial intent. Sentence constructs, vocab tier 2. Student number 2 is going to manipulate the exact same template. Drawing a correlation between herself and the likes of Mr. Rogers, Helen Keller, and MLK, Elizabeth Bonker, in spite of her non-speaking autism, stands as a symbol to her classmates that they all are endowed with an undying freedom to choose their own way. So again, you got allusion and you got ethos. Boiling the purpose of life down to the fundamental precept of service, so that would be the logos, that's her main point, that's her logic. Bonker unifies her audience with collective pronouns to announce that we can be the change makers. So again, they went syntax. She, as case in point, has overcome ginormous obstacles to be a beacon of light in the lives of others. Through sharing and so we're at 3 sentences in, and you can see we have, allusion, ethos, logo, syntax. Last sentence, authorial intent. Through sharing and service, she implores her classmates to be the ones to affect and broker rippling impacts throughout the lives of everyone they come into contact with. It's doing the exact same thing as the first one, right? So you can see the flexing on the syntax, good voice rhythm flow through the manipulation of the syntax. Vocab is nice, and they focus on the 3 to 4 salient terms without it being a rhetorical or a rhetorical dumping ground of terms and devices, right? We don't want that. So that's why I have my students take 3 sentences. I find those 1 sentence theses that students often write just to be a dumping ground of terms and devices. And it's definitely not going to get the sophistication point doing that. It's not artful at all. So very good. Let's take a look at a third, and it's going to go the exact same way. 3 plus 1. Despite the obvious differences between her and her classmates, Elizabeth Bonker addresses the collective we in this day of celebration. So again, you got a little bit of ethos, her differences, the fact that she's different, and then the syntax, the pronoun usage of we. Drawing comparison, so we got the allusion or the juxtaposition. Drawing comparisons between her life and the likes of Helen Keller and concentration camp survivors, she stands before the graduating class as a beacon of light, hope, and promise. Having overcome enormous barriers, she reminds her audience that life is meant to be of service to each other. As her peers embark upon a new journey, she implores them to honor their God-given freedoms, to also be the bearers of humanity's light. Last sentence, teachers say, what's the universal truth? What's the universal theme? What's the exigence? That's what you're answering in that last sentence. I just say authorial intent. What was her purpose in this speech? What was she going for? First 3 sentences, construction of meaning. What terms and devices construct the meaning of the piece? So as always, 4 sentences, tier 2, sentence constructs, out of the gate, blazing speed. So I put a couple balls of yarn on each of these because what we're doing is planting the seeds for the rest of the essay. We're gonna do the yarn test in just a second here as we take a look at body paragraphs. So in the introduction, I liken it to this. I always give this analogy to my students. An introduction is kind of like a quarterback going up to the line of scrimmage and saying, "Hey, defense, before I run this play, I want to tell you what play I'm going to run. And if you really want to know, I'm going to run down 42 blue on the count of 3. And if you don't know what that means, it means I'm going to give the ball over here to this guy over my right shoulder, number 34. On the count of 3, I'm going to give him the ball, and he's going to run right towards your left tackle, pop him in the nose, and go straight to the end zone. Quarterback comes to the line of scrimmage, down 42 blue, passes it to 34, hands it off to 34. 34 does exactly that. So you're kind of calling out your play to your argument right from the line of scrimmage in the introduction. And I call that, laying down the lines of your reason, the yarn of your reason. So we'll see how this all fleshes out in the body paragraphs and how we're going to connect that construction of meaning to the rest of the piece. So good segue here. How do I write the body paragraphs? For those that are familiar with my work, you know that I always say, bust out the syllogistic method. Every body paragraph a kid ever writes can be written syllogistically. For those that are new to me, new to my work, new to my teachings, let me briefly go over the syllogistic method. If this eludes you after my explanation, go into the YouTube channel. There's plenty of videos where I do a deep dive into this and give more historical context, more examples. But in brief, the syllogistic method comes from Aristotle. He ran a school called the Lyceum, and the aristocratic boys would go there to learn about polemics, oration, debate, wordsmithing, word wrangling. And they would throw out these big, juicy, essential questions. And you see some of them in the classic surviving text, like Plato's Republic, where they tussled with the question, what is justice? And these great philosophical students and think tankers would step to the proverbial mic and they would drop their definition of justice, right? So Aristotle, much like us, composition instructors, said, why is it that the likes of Jason crush every debate and Wyeth's just kind of like meh, and Todd just doesn't get it, man. That kid does not get it. We say that about our writers sometimes. We scratch our heads and say, why do some kids get it and some don't? And Aristotle had a eureka moment one day, and he said, I got it. The Jasons of the universe think syllogistically, right? They are very cogent, patterned, well-reasoned, calculated, mathematic, prescriptive in their thinking. And he said, this is what the likes of my great students are doing. They argue premise, conclusion. So he gave a bunch of examples to his students and taught them the basics of inductive and deductive reasoning. And I'll give you a quick example here. So if I were to say in the first premise, arsenic is deadly, second premise, my dog ate arsenic, we'd all naturally conclude that my dog is going to die. Or if I say first premise, any 38-year-old or older non-felon born in the U.S. can run for the presidency. Second premise, James is 42, born in the state of Rhode Island, has no criminal record. Conclusion, James can run for the presidency, right? So when our students write, we want them to be that computative, that locked in, that cogent. But the problem is they are not. And there's many, many reasons for this. The first is that, especially for literary analysis and rhetorical analysis, students begin with the second premise. They begin with their textual support. And this is why when we read their writing, we often say, geez, man, that's like a plot summation of the speech. Basically, they're given a play-by-play, like sports broadcast announcement of Elizabeth Bonker's speech. It's not analysis. And that's the kicker. So when you go premise, conclusion, the first premise is going to be an argument containing the terms and devices. I'm going to model this for you in just a second. The first premise always takes 3 sentences, and there's a reason for this. On FRQ 1 for the AP language exam, the College Board says 3 times, your argument must be central. And for rhetorical analysis, synthesis, literary analysis, persuasion, research, whatever expository mode you're writing in, your argument must be central. And I wish the College Board would give that direction on all 6 FRQs. So in 3 sentences, students can also begin to combine the terms and the devices together so as to break that pattern of 1 paragraph tone, 1 paragraph syntax, 1 paragraph diction, 1 paragraph ethos, etc. So that's too methodic, it's too elementary, and you're definitely not going to get any sophistication merit for writing that way. So we're going to begin to see how the pieces intersect and interconnect with each other. Second premise begins in the 4th sentence, and it's the textual support. So we're going to teeter-totter balance the quoting and the paraphrasing because we have Bonker's speech in front of us. So you don't want to do one far more at the expense of the other. It's kind of a teeter-totter balance. The conclusion is the textual analysis. And that's where you throw your links, your promises, and your echoes. So you've got to go back to the prompt. You got to go back to the thesis, the original thesis, in the conclusion of the syllogistic body paragraph, not the conclusion paragraph of the essay, but the conclusion of the body paragraph. So let's talk about yarn. All right, let me show you the yarn test. This is the first premise for the Elizabeth Bonker essay. Students ask good questions. They first ask, where do I begin? My first body paragraph. And I say, begin where Bonker begins. So you're going to see my students have transitions like this, where they say right from the onset. It cues the reader into knowing that the student is very organized, going to be very chronological, be very sequential. They're going to be methodic in their analysis. So the other question students ask is this: how many sentences should I write in a syllogistic body paragraph? And I tell my guys, shoot for 10 sentences. Probably don't want to exceed 12, otherwise you're going to blow V8 and get wayward and probably break your line of reasoning. So in this first premise, again, it's going to be 3 sentences. Look at the promises that the student makes. The promise is going to be represented by a different color of yarn. So there's going to be 3 promises made in this first premise. So look where we go. Right from the onset, Bonker closes the distance between what separates her from her audience by suggesting that her achievements on this day belong to the collective whole. In spite of her non-speaking autism, there is a plurality in the moment that draws comparison to some of history's greatest figures. Her message is simple. No matter what God bestowed upon the individual, share in the celebration of life. So let's do this here. What is being promised? I always tell my students this. What's the promise of the first premise? Our red ball of yarn is connected to a promise. It says Bonker closes the distance between what separates her from her audience by suggesting that her achievements on this day belong to the collective whole. That's her ethos. So red yarn is going to be ethos. Now we need some quotes and some paraphrases to connect to this red ball of yarn. Since we started with this, in the fourth sentence, we probably want to go red, right? We're going to need red quotes, red paraphrases. Let's see what happens in the green. In spite of her non-speaking autism, there is a plurality in the moment that draws comparisons to some of history's greatest figures. All right, so green is going to be illusion, right? Because you're making comparison to other historical greats. Her message is simple, and this is blue. This is the logos, right? Green is also kind of attached to when you're talking about plurality. I am assuming that we're going to get to the syntactical pronouns here, the use of the we pronouns. So green's kind of multitasking here. And this is what I mean by a multitasking first premise. Instead of going one paragraph tone, one paragraph syntax, one paragraph pathos, one paragraph ethos, we got a whole bunch of stuff going on in here. And that's why I like taking 3 sentences. So a student's got to juggle this all. But how do you sustain that line of reasoning? How do you keep the promise of the first premise? Well, we need green quotes, green paraphrases, blue quotes, blue paraphrases. So I make these little graphic organizers, these quote trackers, paraphrase trackers, to help students early in the academic year until they can do this independently on their own. So let's go to the fourth sentence. Immediately, Bonker aligns herself with her audience by suggesting that today we celebrate our achievements. Even though there's a singular person affected by a form of autism that doesn't allow her to speak, the collective we is gathered in the moment to share in their mutual achievements. Well, let's double check here. Weren't we going to talk about ethos, her person, her character? Look at those quotes. Look at those paraphrases, right? And we're already into the green a little bit because we're talking about the syntactical feature of the plural pronoun, right? So we're good. We have the right quotes. We have the right paraphrases. I always tell my students, keep your quotes and your paraphrases germane to your promise. So this red is connected. We have to get to the green and to the blue eventually. So let's see where this goes. It is a miracle that a critical intervention unlocked her mind from its silent cage. But she did not do this alone. So let's talk about these quotes, because this is silky smooth. This kid's crushing it. There's a template for my quotes as well, for quote transitions. I call it the 5-word rule. If a student places a minimum of 5 words in front of the quote and keeps the quote small, it should sound conversational. And if it doesn't, do like what my student did here at the arrow. Bracket, right? So liberally bracket to keep it conversational. All right, we quote, we analyze. Keep the promise of the first premise. As graduates from Rollins College, they all should know one simple fact. Sharing gives meaning to life. And this is what Bonker is doing, sharing the joy of the collective moment together. All right, so let's go back to our promise here. We got to bring in green because we haven't talked about green yet. And green is the illusion. So let's see this here. We got to have some quotes and some paraphrases for the green. She, like her hero, Helen Keller, despite their seemingly insurmountable odds, is able to uphold the legacy of Rollins' most prominent alum, Mr. Rogers. And again, you're doing all that stuff with sentence constructs and vocab. Look at that sentence. She, comma, like her hero, comma, Helen Keller, comma, despite their seemingly insurmountable odds, comma, right? So very complex sentence. You don't have to do it every time, but every now and then, bust it out. Show that you got complexity. Show that you got some chops. On a piece of paper in his wallet when he passed away, was written, "Life is for service." No matter one's lot in life, we all can share the fiat lux that burns in each individual soul. Calling upon the words of Viktor Frankl, Bonker reminds her audience that they should and can share their last crumb of bread with each other. So now we're into the blue. What was that, right? The logos, the main theme, the exigence of her speech. So let's see where we go with this. All right. Now, well, hold on, let me go back. So we got the illusions in the green. We got Keller, Frankel, Mr. Rogers, right? And then we're implicitly in that, we're kind of hitting upon the logos. So we got the syntax, the ethos, the illusion, the logos, all tied together. So are all these quotes and paraphrases germane to the promise of the first premise? Yes. So what I do literally with my students is this. We project their essays. I have a basket of yarn in my room, and kids have to connect the yarn. So connect the red to a red quote, a red paraphrase. Connect the green to a green quote, a green paraphrase. Connect the blue to a blue quote, a blue paraphrase, right? And go in order, right? Since you said red first, it should come first, green second, blue third, right? Have sequence, chronology, order, logic. Now we're at the conclusion of the syllogism, not the conclusion paragraph. You just can't end on a quote. You got to wrap it all up. Go echo that thesis, echo the prompt, link to the prompt, keep the promise of the first premise. That's the essence of life, the power of sharing, right? So now you're back at authorial intent. You're back at the thesis. So as they embark upon their separate ways, they must remember to choose a path that holds space for being of service to others, right? So you kind of end with the authorial intent again. So you end where you begin. You begin where you end. A syllogism's a circle. Bring it all back. So if you want, as you go over this with your kids, you can take a look at the whole paragraph minus my balls of yarn and walk them through it just kind of visually, orally, take them right through it. So there it is for you. That's what it looks like. It's a little on the long side. It's right at 13 sentences, but it's nonetheless pretty good. Stays cogent. It's very logical, very well reasoned. Very much arsenic is deadly. My dog ate arsenic. My dog is going to die. It goes that systematically, that bulletproof through. So the question students often ask is, what do I do next? My students on all FRQs, so for Lang and Lit, write 4 paragraphs, intro, 2 bodies, conclusion. And if the student is to go on in this essay, what do you do? What do you do for the second body paragraph? Stitch more yarn. There's still a bunch of rhetorical terms and devices that have yet to be analyzed, and still a lot of text, because we're still only in like the upper third of the text. There's still, the bottom 2/3 of the text to analyze. Switch up the terms and devices and have at it. Stitch more yarn. 3 sentences first premise. Align the promises with a ball of yarn, and just string it. And then if you do a new essay, same yarn test, right? New expository mode, same yarn test. It doesn't matter. So I'm running long here, so let me wrap this up. So for those of you that are interested in doing some professional development with me, or to take a deeper dive into this, know that I have a whole bunch of PD offerings coming up with the National Writing Project. So we have hooked up together, and my Teach It Right 5-week mastermind is now being run through them. I'm still the lead teacher, and what we've been doing is meeting Sunday nights at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, going to 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, so just 1 hour for 5 straight weeks, so a 5-hour course, followed by Q&A, which goes about 15-20 minutes, but you can hop off the Zoom call if you have to. Here's the kicker, though. National Writing Project is awarding a 10-hour completion badge for the 5-week mastermind. And there are other courses. So let's say you're like, oh, that's too much, too big of a commitment. We have the self-paced course, which offers all the goodies of the 5-week mastermind, but it's a 10 video. It's about 10 hours of video, replete with tons of handouts, exercises, ready-made lesson plans, at your disposal. We also are offering my alternative grading methods, 2-hour intensive, the teaching line of reasoning 2-hour intensive, Plato's Plato discussion modality. So stay tuned. Take a look at www.nwp.org, or you can go to www.teachinghowtowrite.com, which is my website, and we'll keep you abreast and appraised of all my comings and goings and the irons in the fire. Also note that it's just about that time where Tim Freitas, Brandon Abden, and I will be showing up at NCTE in Anaheim, California to do our presentation together. And then on occasion, what I'll be doing throughout the academic year is some free webinars with Perfection Learning. And that's about it. So hopefully you found this to be useful and can use it with your kids. If you have any questions, you can shoot me an email at teachingwritingcoach@gmail.com. For now, be well, happy teaching, happy writing.